In our last video, we finished wrapping up talking about, modern Japan or pre-modern Japan during the time period of the Qing Dynasty and the social changes and continuities that were occurring at that point. Now we should focus to Japan. We should see some similarities, but also some changes in comparison when we talk about China and Japan at the same time. So, as a part of review, we want to remember that the Chinese emperor, Japanese emperor, is a figurehead. Essentially, he is believed to be descended from the gods, but does not have any actual power. It's more of a veneration of the position, and the emperor doesn't really make any decisions or have really any control. It's the shogun, who is more of a local lord who has risen to power, who has, who runs the country and the army and the military and all of that. And so one particular shogun in particular is what we're going to look at for this video, or one particular shogunate or family of shoguns that dominates for a long time in that exchange. So, but between between the 1300s and early 1600s, shoguns were often involved in what we consider to be essentially clan civil wars. Different shoguns or different clans, I should say, involved in local clan wars or daimyo wars. So the daimyos being again the lords and nobles and upper classes of Japan, similar to like the landed and scholar gentry of China. And this is aided by the fact that Europeans were now introducing guns and cannons to Japan at this time, as they were arriving again at this point in Asia around the globe, which gives certain clans power over others. So Japan is kind of in this transition period, during the 1300s through the early 1600s, until one shogunate or one daimyo can really take over, and that is under the Tokugawa shogunate. And Tokugawa is kind of the family name, and they essentially rule in the name of the emperor for about 250 plus years. Okay, so from about 1600 is when they unify Japan under their power, and they have it until about 1867. Part of that is, as we'll see, due in part into the United States and their influence and impact that they're going to have. And so a lot of that, what allows them to rise through that power and maintain the power for the next 250 plus years, is the profit and money coming in from the silver trade, okay, and then investing that money back in with the merchant class to limit the power of the daimyos. So on this upper right-hand corner, you can kind of see a map of, so these are the actual individuals of the Tokugawa family taking over territory from, in and around Tokyo in the blue areas, and then you can kind of see them expanding over time to pretty much the rest of the main islands within Japan, the main 4 islands anyway. Well, in this case, I guess we don't see, I think that's no, I don't know if that's Hokkaido. I don't know the names of the Japanese islands by heart, but the most northern island. But they definitely conquered the other 3 or have control over them. Not necessarily conquering, but, forcing the other daimyos to submit to their will and power and authority, that by 1600, they are the ones essentially running the country. So, and the way that they're able to do this, obviously, as I said, silver generated profits. So again, Japan is bringing their silver and selling off their silver because they know that Europeans need that to change and exchange goods with China, and they're doing the same as well because they want Chinese goods at the same time too. So that control that they're using with the money, also they maintain control by having the daimyos forcing them to live every other year at the capital, and they kind of trade off which daimyos are there at any given time. So that means that the daimyos have to spend money to impress the other daimyos as kind of a competition of I can one-up you, and saying I have to have a really expensive palace or place of living for me and my family, as well as invest in all this stuff in the capital, while also investing back home too. So spending money on that, and rather than spending the money on the military clans, essentially their samurai warriors, their local militias and armies, so that reduces their role and effectiveness in that power, because they have to divide their money at home, but also in the capital to impress the other daimyos, the shogun, and the emperor. Okay, marriages have to be approved by the shoguns, as well as travel limitations and the amount of work that they can do on their own castles. All of this again is the shogun saying, if you don't do this, we're going to tax you, or we might kill you, or punish you with other means to do so. Otherwise, they're also limiting contact with other daimyos, and they have to be approved by the shogun before they meet the emperor. So pretty much putting on full control of saying, you can't do this if you are a lord unless you get the approval of the shogun. At the same time, they also limit foreign contact. So Japan, as being a big part of that foreign trade of the silver with China and Europe, decides to cut back in the 1600s and just invest within Japan. And a lot of this is focused on maintaining stability within Japan, all right, because they don't want to go back into, periods of civil war and infighting. And instead, they feel like if they can limit outside influence and outside pressures, they can actually maintain and keep Japan whole and just be self-sustaining. That's kind of the intent that the Japanese are having. They've also taken note that, the expansion of, the Europeans in the Indian Ocean, but also the Spanish having taken over the Philippines. And Japan does not want to do that. Japan wants to remain a sovereign nation, or I should say a sovereign state. So some of the things that they do, includes expelling many Europeans, persecuting, and at some points banning Christianity, as the book definitely describes. It's pretty much any European novels, books, writings are thrown out and destroyed. Limiting where Europeans can be and which Europeans are there, especially the Dutch are really the only ones who are able to maintain any sort of connection to the Japanese, because they want to know about the outside world and the new technologies and innovations, but they only limit a small number of people to do so. At the same time, limiting the number of Japanese who can leave the islands legally to conduct trade or to go travel throughout other places. So essentially, they're only trading and conducting travel with the Korean Peninsula, with China, and with the Dutch. That's about it. All right. So in terms of maintaining economic stability and social stability, and also I guess I should say back down here. Here's like an image of the shogun meeting with his advisors. The shogun in the middle of that image. So the economic and social change that occurs under the Tokugawa shogunate, but also, what is staying the same. So with the end of internal conflict, that leads to increased agricultural production and innovation. So now they're shifting, just as as China had shifted away from subsistence agriculture, where you're providing for yourself and your family, to commercial. So producing cash crops to, again, increase self-sufficiency across all of Japan. And this leads to population increasing between, initial large gap in the early 1600s to a slow, moderate growth in 1850. And this is, again, due very similarly to the fact that, or not similarly to, but as a resulting thing that's similar to China, is Japan has a high physiological density. Japan is very mountainous, and thus, because of that, that limits the amount of land that they can actually use for agricultural practices. And so Japan does not want to overextend itself by having too much of a population and not enough to feed itself. Again, the idea of being self-sufficient and not relying on foreign influences. So what they advocate for, increased use of birth control. They actually do promote, or I don't know if promoting is the right way to say it, but there is an acceptance of abortion, again, to limit the population growth, as well as delayed marriages, which, the later you marry in life, the fewer kids you're more likely to have, to slow down that population growth. But that also leads to increase of wealth, because that way you're not spending money on having, so many kids, because your kids need to be fed, clothed, educated. So if you focus on 1 or 2 kids instead of 3, 4, 5, 6, that saves more money for your family. Okay. But they also work on protecting and renewing the Japanese forest, which is a part of what was done with the silver trade notes that we looked at previously before winter break. At the same time, we also see comparisons within Japan's social statuses similar to that of China. These are differences in terms of, what they do to slow their population growth from China. But, we see that the similarity with, commercial push for commercial adventures and commercial creations instead of subsistence ones. So similar to China, similar social classes, okay? Merchants are really ranked low. And then the daimyos, the warriors and samurai, and the emperor ranked really, really high. Obviously, goes, emperor, shogun, daimyos, samurai, and then, laborers, farmers, and then merchants are kind of near the bottom there. And again, or not again, in China, it was more of a informal recognition of the growing power of the merchants. In Japan, there was a better acceptance of it that reversed as the markets as the markets grew, the more production that they were making, and the growth of trade. So this is similar again to the connection to Confucianism, which also had a role within Japan all this time. Okay, so As a result of this, because of the increasing spots and positions for the merchants, shoguns are encouraging the daimyo and the samurai to learn and become educated rather than to fight, which again weakens their status because that way, again, they're less likely to rebel. There's less focus on the whole honor system. While honor is still really, really important within Japan, this way they're focusing more on education and not on fighting. So a lot of them, they end up losing a lot of land and money because the more land they're converting to rice cultivation, but now there's too much rice, so thus low prices means that they go into debt and then they have to sell off a lot of their money. And a lot of the daimyos are spending their money on these lavish locations in the capital to impress other daimyos, the shogun, and the emperor. So splitting their money in so many different areas leads to a lot of them going bankrupt and essentially losing their status. At the same time, we see that increase with, the merchants now having closer ties to the shogun, but also having, again, more money to buy more land, buy more products, start new businesses because of that increase in trade. So while many of the daimyos are, losing that power, it's increasing within the merchants. So as we just kind of briefly mentioned a minute ago, the Tokugawa follow Confucian education and ideals. Okay, filial piety follows here. Again, the idea of the whole family status, and respect, in order to, again, create and stabilize control of the area. Because, again, they don't want Japan falling back into areas of civil war or clan warfare. But at the same time, where many of the shoguns are pushing for Confucian education, a lot of Japanese people are also, again, in the higher, levels, saying, why are we focusing and using Chinese beliefs and philosophies and not our own? So there is a pushback in here while, the Tokugawas are pushing for Confucian ideas, and there's some support behind that. You also have a lot of resistance focusing on Japanese culture instead of, mixing it in with Chinese culture. Okay. And so some examples of this are what you see more in the urban areas within Japan. So think about, again, Tokyo, Kyoto, other major cities where you begin to see what we call the floating worlds, which is the urban culture, which is more secular, it's more laid back, has less control, the shoguns have less control of this than they do of the daimyos and the local, lords. Again, this is kind of the reverse, that the main cities, while still, loyal to Japan and to the shogun and the emperor, have less restrictions, and so they're able to be more secular. They're able to, engage in stuff that would be considered non-Confucian behavior, in the sense of, secular music, secular art forms. So kabuki theater, where I have an image in here, and you can just kind of YouTube kabuki theater for that. The okaying of brothels and tea houses, public baths, which is kind of contrary and contradicting of what the Tokugawa shogunates wanted. So that is also kind of a result of the economic changes that were happening in the increase of wealth, because now you have people, again, having more avenues to spend their money, and this is what they're choosing to spend it on. Okay, at the same time, we also see within Christianity, as I said, also comes in for a time period similar to what we saw in China, but again, much bigger pushback, because again, you talk about the idea of, the one true religion doesn't really bode well with Buddhism or Shintoism. And so because they viewed it as a threat, they began to persecute Christians, as the book really does describe, where they would actually kill a lot of Christian missionaries and people who converted, or would, threaten pain of death if they did not convert away from the religion. So again, a lot of this, again, coming out of the stability provided by the Tokugawa shogunate in terms of the increased economic changes. But then on top of that, while they're, putting in all these strict structures on the daimyos, the more middle and lower classes are getting more freedoms and turning towards ways to spend their money, leading to, again, the increase of wealth for the merchants, laborers, and people like that within the world of the floating, or the idea of the floating worlds, that kind of undermines the Tokugawa lifestyle following the Confucian ideals. So those are the changes that have been going on within Japan, and that kind of wraps up the chapter. So that is where we will stop here.